Hi, my name is Sam, and I use the pronouns she and her. So far, we have an understanding of gender dysphoria, its diagnosis, and its DSM criteria. And I'm going to dive into the article with you, which you already saw a little preview of on the last slide. So our group sought to research on people's lived experiences, implications for this diagnosis in healthcare, particularly on youth, and how the treatment of offering steps to social, medical, and legal transition can lead to gender euphoria, which is the goal. So this brought us to the aforementioned study on the last slide conducted in Sweden, where trans-specific healthcare is included in general health insurance, which you don't necessarily see all around the world, even in the United States. That's very inconsistent. So in 1972, Sweden actually became the first country to legalize access to trans-affirming care. Looking to Sweden for how that legal process has worked and transpired through its healthcare system can be helpful to other countries looking to provide trans-affirming care to their citizens. So a follow-up to that, in 2010, the government did a review of their healthcare system and the trans-affirming care happening within the country. And they concluded that even though there's this law that there has to be access, they found that the evaluation, treatment, and then the wait times to actually receiving that care varied greatly based on where that person was in the country, what hospital they were at, what doctors were seeing them. So in 2015, 5 years after getting that data, they put out a new set of guidelines to try to fix some of the flaws that were inherent in the system. Now, a group of researchers decided to look at that 2015 guideline update to see how it could potentially be improved and what kind of flaws there might be in it. And they found three major ones. So the first is that the policy approaches, how it approaches non-linear gender. Basically, this concept is heavily focused on, in the evaluation portion of these guidelines, while individuals are not required to have a lifelong history of gender euphoria, the evaluator needs to support the individual looking through all of the options available to them on how different transition options are going to change their body physically. Now, for instance, a child who's assigned female at birth who may have been socialized in a more feminine woman gender role, who grew up wearing dresses and skirts and otherwise presenting in a stereotypically feminine way, wouldn't automatically be barred from affirming transition options to be more masculine presenting. However, there is trans-medicalism embedded into this. If you aren't familiar with trans-medicalism, it's the idea that gender isn't a binary. You're either male or female, and that if someone wants to transition from the gender assigned at birth, they need to go through a series of medical transition to physically change their body from one to the other. And we know, especially as social workers, that gender is a large spectrum. It's not even a linear line. It is a constantly moving three-dimensional space. For some people, gender is not steady and stable at one point. There's gender fluidity. There are people who are non-binary. So this idea of gender that they put out, that it is consistent and is static and shouldn't change, and is gonna, if you're going to transition and receive a affirming care, you're going to go from point A to point B, or from point B to point A, it just does not fit for everyone's lived experience. So there's trans-medicalism embedded into this system. Additionally, there's another paradox here, that the evaluation process is longer if you don't seek support for gender dysphoria in your youth, But when a trans youth comes forward, they can be denied care because of their age, which can lead to further mental health challenges because they're barred from taking steps to approach closer to gender euphoria. Which leads us back to the second problem that researchers dubbed the mental health paradox. So this paradox is that the diagnosis of gender dysphoria is required for care, but however, to receive treatment, the guidelines state that people need to be mentally and physically healthy. So, if somebody receives that diagnosis of gender dysphoria, depending on the doctor they get, well, that doctor may say, well, you're not mentally healthy, so you can't make this decision for yourself. But as we said before in the presentation, one of the best treatments for gender dysphoria is transition. And there's all sorts of research that goes into that if people go through transition who have gender dysphoria, their mental health challenges improve because they're feeling gender euphoria in the small moments when they're with themselves or when somebody in a crowd addresses them in an affirming way and doesn't misgender them. So young people who are denied care because of their age just statistically are at higher risk for depression, anxiety, and suicidal ideation. So on top of that, if a young person who, because they are young, does not have access to different types of transition options, ends up developing depression, anxiety, on top of being, isolated from peers and potentially family, if they report further into their care as they get older that they're experiencing depression, anxiety, and suicidal ideation, they're even more likely to be barred from receiving care because they won't be labeled mentally healthy. So that's the big paradox. And in addition to this, the guidelines highlight that the mental illness among people with trans experiences can stem from marginalization, discrimination, cisnormativity, and heteronormativity. And that brings us to the third problem that researchers dubbed gender dysphoria as a psychiatric, psychological, and psychosocial problem, which really harkens directly back to all the social issues that compile into the guidelines in different ways. So to go deeper into that, it really addresses the intersections that we have of transphobia, ableism, and sexism in Swedish society and also around the world. So a previous study showed that social factors such as occupational choices, marriage status, if somebody was a parent or if somebody wanted to be a parent, these were reasons for people to be denied access to gender affirming care and medical procedures in a range of contexts. This is because the society in some ways still focuses on gender roles. Additionally, the guidelines outline the goal of treatment as reaching something called, that they label, gender stability, which once again works to set up a binary gender instead of inclusive gender practices, and keeps up that theme of trans medicalism that I was talking about before. So as non-binary folks, transitions are seen as failures by the guidelines if they happen at all, because that individual would need a highly informed evaluator to recognize that that individual needs that care beyond what the guidelines are outlining. In other words, that if the goal of administering trans-affirming care to individuals is for them to reach a stable gender, if someone is non-binary, gender fluid, gender gray, then they may not have that classification. Even if they choose all of the options that are affirming to them, the government and the policies may not see it as reaching a stable gender and would thus literally label the care that they received and the treatment a failure. Even if the individual's like, I'm good, like I'm feeling myself, I'm feeling gender euphoric when I look at myself. But then if you have a whole system in society saying, oh, this was a failure, how is that going to affect someone's mental health and healing? So we highlight this because even though this is such a progressive policy of trying to ensure that people receive care, there's still trans erasure happening, because non-binary people are trans people, and part of the trans community because they aren't cisgender. So this study really sought to improve a groundbreaking new policy which can improve the outcomes for people around the world with enough advocacy and further research. So we have to start somewhere to make a better future for trans kids everywhere. And I hope that we can carry some of these lessons with us as we go into our practice. And who knows, maybe you're not going to be at a 501c3, maybe you'll be at a 501c4 and actually able to make some institutional changes more, politically speaking. So I hope you enjoyed this, and I hope that you enjoy looking at our resources on the next slide.